Hello and welcome to WePC Benchmarks. My name is Seb and today I'm taking a look at the new game Kenna Bridge of Spirits and benchmarking it with 11 GPUs to see how well it performs. The game has just been released from the studio Ember Labs as their first endeavour into the gaming world, and you can see that the art style has really come through with the adorable rot that you use for solving puzzles and the rest of the character and world design. It has been released as a Sony exclusive but is also on PC on the Epic Store. So let's take a look and see how it performs. We start off with the RTX 3090, and at 1080p it averages 145 FPS, for 1% of 87 and 0.1% of 34. Moving up, and at 1440p it gives us an average of 112 FPS, with a 1% of 91 and a 0.1% of 72. And then at 4K we get an average of 62 FPS, with a 1% of 45 and a 0.1% of 15. Next up is the RX 6900 XT. And at 1080p it averages 135 FPS with a 1% of 116 and a 0.1% of 86. Then at 1440p the card averages 100 FPS with a 1% of 87 and a 0.1% of 70. And then at 4K it averages 56 FPS with a 1% of 4 and a 0.1% of 4 as well. The next GPU is the RTX 3080, and at 1080p it averages 139 FPS with a 1% of 91 and a 0.1% of 69. And then at 1440p the card averages at 97 FPS with a 1% of 71 and a 0.1% of 58. And at 4K it averages 57 FPS with a 1% of 50 and a 0.1% of 40. Up next is the RX 6800 XT, and at 1080p it averages 117 FPS with a 1% of 105 and a 0.1% of 72. Moving up to 1440p and it averages 90 FPS with a 1% of 80 and a 0.1% of 72. And then at 4K it averages to 50 FPS with a 1% of 10 and a 0.1% of 4. Then is the RTX 3060 Ti. The card averages 95 FPS at 1080p with a 1% of 81 and a 0.1% of 27. Then up at 1440p the card averages 68 FPS with a 1% of 58 and a 0.1% of 33. And then at 4K it averages 37 FPS with a 1% of 4 and a 0.1% of 4 as well. The RX 6600 XT is next, and at 1080p the card averages 77 FPS with a 1% of 64 and a 0.1% of 33. Moving up to 1440p the card averages 52 FPS with a 1% of 45 and a 0.1% of 43. And then at 4K the card averages 26 FPS with a 1% of 4 and a 0.1% of 4 as well. Next up is the RTX 2070 Super, and at 1080p it averages 83 FPS with a 1% of 66 and a 0.1% of 56. Moving up to 1440p and it averages 60 FPS with a 1% of 52 and a 0.1% of 38. And then at 4K it averages 33 FPS with a 1% of 3 and a 0.1% of 3 as well. Moving on to the RX 5700 XT, and at 1080p it averages 70 FPS with a 1% of 61 and a 0.1% of 56. Then at 1440p it averages 51 FPS with a 1% of 45 and a 0.1% of 44. And up to 4K the game averages 28 FPS with a 1% of 10 and a 0.1% of 4. Next is the RX 580. And at 1080p it averages 35 FPS with a 1% of 31 and a 0.1% of 29. Moving up to 1440p and it averages 26 FPS with a 1% of 22 and a 0.1% of 14. And then at 4K it averages 13 FPS with a 1% of 11 and a 0.1% of 3. The next GPU is the GTX 1050 Ti, and at 1080p it averages 19 FPS for 1% of 15 and a 0.1% of 7. Moving up to 1440p, it averages 13 FPS with a 1% of 3 and a 0.1% of 3 as well. At 4K, it averages 7 FPS with a 1% of 6 and a 0.1% of 6. And lastly we have the GT 1030, and this one I could only manage to get testing done for 1080p. And so on low settings, it averages 11 FPS for 1% of 9 and a 0.1% of 9. Up to medium, and it averages 10 FPS with a 1% of 6 and a 0.1% of 3. And then at high, it averages 6 FPS with a 1% of 5 and a 0.1% of 5 as well. So, there you have it. Kenna Bridge of Spirits benchmarked with 11 GPUs. And as you can see, up to the RX 580 you can easily get 60 FPS at 1080p on ultra settings. However, for 4K Ultra, it seems to require a 3090 to get us a stable 60 FPS, which is very indented for the game. But even on lower resolutions, it looks absolutely gorgeous and is still very enjoyable. Hopefully this video has been helpful, and thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.